the last day of the war. Now, for this, I do just want to explain. When the war comes to an end, Adolf Hitler commits suicide at the end of April 1945. The Nazi government still exists. They're still really in control for basically a week. However, after that week, what we're going to see is they're just really negotiating the end of the war. Now, this is where things are a bit more complicated because at the end of the war, we're going to have a situation where Germany is thoroughly defeated. It's over. Berlin is occupied. It's burned to the ground. There's nothing else to do. How does this compare to how World War I comes to an end? How does World War I stop? They just can't stop. They just sign the armistice. It's just done. Yeah, like an hour ago, I think? No. Oh, another? Okay. All right, we'll do. Okay. Now, what we're going to have is what's called VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. Now, this comes when the Nazi government that's still in existence officially and unconditionally surrenders. They completely give decision-making power over to the Allies and say, you get to dictate how the war comes to an end. Now, I asked you guys question number 3 because I'm saying, let's throw some ideas out there. Evan, I love the idea of saying, let's just punish them, let's crush them. I like the idea of saying, well, let's just let the Soviets occupy them. Or maybe let's let the Americans occupy them. All these are going to be thrown out there. We need to figure out what we're going to do with them long term. Starting on May 8th, 1945, Germany ceases to exist the way that they had. They're going to be occupied by 4 major powers. Now, I give you guys very few dates. This is one you got to remember. On May 8th, 1945, when Germany unconditionally surrenders, General Eisenhower is going to accept it. Now, I do need to ask, where have we seen General Eisenhower before? What was he responsible for? He's responsible for the D-Day invasion. He's the supreme Allied commander. So now, he's the one who's running Germany. Now he's in charge. He's the one that's going to have to decide, what do we do now? How do we go forward? But I do want to point something out. We've been talking about this weird alliance where we have the Brits, the Americans, and the Russians. The Brits and the Americans are democratic republics. What are the Russians? What's their system of government? They're communists. What was the only thing holding the alliance together? Common enemy. Now what do we have holding us together? Basically nothing. Now we're not finished with the war yet. In May of 45, the Japanese are still fighting. So I do want to explain kind of where we go here for really organizational purposes. I've made the mistake in the past by going just purely chronologically. In 1941, this is what happens in Europe, and this is what happens in the Pacific. In 1942, this is what happens in Europe and in the Pacific. And I think it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to do it that way. So what we're going to do is, we're finished with the war in Europe. Now we got to go back in time, and we're going to do the war in the Pacific. Because we're fighting in 2 theaters at the same time. We're fighting against the Nazis in Europe, while we're fighting against the Japanese in the Pacific. So we got to go all the way back to Pearl Harbor. Now remember, at Pearl Harbor, did the Japanese have a lot of success? Had a lot of success. Did they have total success? No, what did they miss? They missed the carriers. But really, that's it. We are going to have those aircraft carriers, and they're really the only thing that protects us from a Japanese invasion of the West Coast. I believe I told you guys before, they could have invaded as far as Chicago before we could have stopped them without those carriers. Which means now that at Pearl Harbor, the surface fleet's been decimated. The Japanese are going to expand farther than they ever had before, and they start gobbling up more of Asia. They take more of Southeast Asia. They take more islands. They're unstoppable because there's no one to challenge them. So from 41 into 42, for 6 straight months, they can do whatever they want in the Pacific. They gobble up a huge empire. Now, I do want to remind you, or ask you, I guess, why do the Japanese need to expand? Why do they keep having to go further and further? What are they looking for? What is it? They need natural resources. It's those natural resources that's their Achilles heel. You cut them off from the natural resources, they're going to fall apart. But now I got to ask, can we do anything to stop them? Can we send the carriers, I guess? Yes, you could. What happens if you lose them? We get invaded. So those carriers are the only thing we've got. The Japanese know this, and they can do whatever they want. There's no one to stop their expansion in the Pacific. They keep going. Now they're going to set their sights almost immediately on a Pacific group of islands that the Americans have controlled for almost 50 years. They are going to set their sights on the Philippines. Now, I need you to think way back. The United States controlled the Philippines for almost 50 years. Do you happen to remember what was it that allowed us to have control of the Philippines? I'll give you a hint, it's a war. Which war gave us control of the Philippines? Do you remember? Excellent. Spanish-American War gives us the Philippines. Now, we had talked about this before. The Philippines are a real nice holding to have. Why is it so nice that we hold the Philippines for almost 50 years? What is the thing about it that makes them so valuable? Not necessarily a hold. There's a little bit. There's some. I'm talking about, think proximity. Remember what we were looking for back then? What was it? Riddick, remember? Trade, that's part of it. Can you explain a little further? You're absolutely right. They were a stepping stone on the way to China. They're just a little colony that we have in the Pacific that allows us to project power throughout the region. The Japanese set their sights on taking the Philippines. Now let's talk not just even strategically holding that, but just like psychologically. How does it look if the Japanese just swoop up and take an American colony? Is there anything we can really do about it? Not really. Now, we do have American troops stationed in the Philippines, but there's not a whole lot of them. The Japanese are going to send huge numbers to take the Philippines. They're going to send 200,000 Japanese troops. We have just a few thousand there. There's nothing we can do. Nothing you can do to stop them. They're going to take the Philippines. But we've got kind of a big problem. There happens to be a very high-ranking member of the American Navy that's in the Philippines at the time. That very high-ranking member of the U.S. Navy has a lot of information, and he is very, very valuable. So let's kind of play this out. What happens if the Japanese get a hold of that admiral? Are they going to get some information out of him? Remember when I told you guys about what the Nazis used to do to get information out of people? The Japanese were worse. Japanese had a lot of things they would do for torture. What they really liked, this is one of their favorites, they'd take bamboo shards and insert them under your fingernails. That's just a starter. They're much worse. We'll talk about that more going forward. However, this admiral is very, very high up, which means he has the highest security clearance that we have. General Douglas MacArthur is going to be in charge of the Philippines, and President Roosevelt gets word out to him and says, I need you back here immediately. Get out of the Philippines right now. You need to get out of there before you're overrun and you fall into the hands of the Japanese. What Roosevelt is basically saying is, You leave right now. MacArthur just says as a response to him, he goes, well, what do I do with the thousands of troops that are here? You getting them out too? And Roosevelt just says to him, we don't have time for that. I'm getting you out and leaving them behind. Does that sound like a bad situation in which to be? MacArthur tells President Roosevelt, I'm not leaving. You can come get me if you want, but I'm not going. Roosevelt just responds by saying, this is not an option. This is an order from the commander-in-chief. You're leaving now. We will figure out what to do with those thousands of men later on. MacArthur begrudgingly leaves his men, but he tells them, I shall return. I will be back. It's a promise that probably doesn't hold a whole lot of weight at the time. These thousands of men that are left behind are going to fall back to what they think, and they're correct, the most defendable part of the islands. They fall back to the Bataan Peninsula, and they come up with a slogan, and this is probably really just kind of rally themselves. What they said is, we have no mama, we have no papa, we have no Uncle Sam. We're the battling bastards of Bataan. They fall back to the Bataan Peninsula, and they're just overrun. They hold out as long as they can, but they run out of supplies, they run out of ammunition. The Japanese have them overwhelmed by about 30-1. Nothing they can do. What we're going to see is something that's really telling about the enemy that we're facing now. The Japanese are going to capture what's left of these few thousand men, and these American and Filipinos surrender. Now, this is what's so telling about the Japanese. In the Japanese culture, surrender is just unheard of. You can't do it. It's the most disgraceful thing you can do. They would rather die than surrender. Now, we're going to learn this more as we go. That instead of surrender, the Japanese will choose suicide. So when these Americans and Filipinos do surrender, the Japanese can't wrap their minds around it. It's not what they do. So they think these people that surrendered are worthy of any treatment that you want to give them. The Japanese will march these POWs 100 miles in 100+ degree heat with 100% humidity, with random beatings and random killings and horrible atrocities and systematic starvation. We've just got a little window into who we're up against. Things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. Now, with that said, real fast, when's your reading quiz? Oh my goodness, when is it?
Tuesday.
On Tuesday. Be certain you're ready for that. Have a good day. I will see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Mann.
Certainly, have a good day, guys.